Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to the Underrot dungeon on Mythic.
Our aim in this guide is to give you all the information that you need to clear this place in the early weeks of Mythic 0, however much of the information easily applies to high Mythic Plus keys. There's a lot to go over, so let's jump straight in.
So as you zone into the instance, you'll see two large packs of ticks. These need to be avoided if possible, because they each apply a stacking dot to the tank, and when they die, they will explode, dealing damage to the entire group. If you do end up pulling them, which you probably will, get ready to either stagger their deaths on high Mythic Plus keys, or use a defensive cooldown when they all explode. Move away from the Savage Cleave the Blood Matron cast after charging a player. You also want to soothe off the Enrage 100% haste buff it applies to everything via its Warcry cast. As this cast can't be interrupted, you want to focus the Matron down over other adds, and try and limit how many adds you pull whilst also fighting a Blood Matron. Headhunters will root a random player for 8 seconds whilst dealing ticking damage to them. The healer might need to spot heal this player as they are unable to move from other abilities. Blood Priests will spam cast Blood Bolt onto a random player. Avoid interrupting this, as instead you want to save your interrupts for the Dark Reconstitution heal and the Gift of Gahun buff that it will place on other trash. This buff will increase the mob's damage by 100% and prevent them from dying for 25 seconds. If this does go through because you missed the interrupt, then the buff can be purged. You want to spread at least 5 yards when fighting the Befouled Spirits, as they channel Dark Omen onto a random player, dealing ticking damage to anyone nearby. You also want to make sure that you interrupt their Harrowing Despair cast, as it deals a ton of damage to the entire group. After clearing either the left or right hand side path, you'll reach Elder Liaxa.
Now when players take any damage from this boss's abilities, they will gain the Taint of Gahun debuff, which deals ticking damage and absorbs a set amount of incoming healing. This is only removed when the healing absorb is out healed, but it can stack fast if players keep taking damage from the boss, so it's very important that you dodge as many abilities as possible. Liaxa will cast Blood Bolt on the tank, dealing a small burst of damage. This is the only interruptible cast in the fight, so you might as well rotate kicks to keep the Taint of Gahun debuffs to a minimum. Make sure you dodge the creeping rot orb that crawls across the encounter space. You can see which direction it will move, as the boss will face a player to cast it, giving you more than enough time to move out of its path. You need to dodge the boss when she teleports to a random player and casts Sanguine Feast, dealing a burst of damage to anyone nearby. You'll need to nuke down the Blood Effigy ad when the boss casts Blood Mirror. This ad will cast Blood Bolt and Sanguine Feast, just like the boss does. Each time the boss casts Blood Mirror, an additional Blood Effigy ad will spawn, which could easily overwhelm you on long fights with high keys. So when coming to this boss, you want to make sure that you have Bloodlust as well as all your cooldowns, and when the ads spawn, just instantly nuke them while dodging their abilities. When moving towards the next boss, you'll fight a ton of different beasts, including the packs of ticks that you saw at the beginning of the instance. Maggots will face a random player and spew out a rotten bile breath. You'll need to sidestep out of this, as it does do a lot of damage. Blood Swarmers will fixate on random players for 15 seconds. You should use slows and displacements and stuns to help the fixated player kite them around. They will also cast Sonic Screech, which deals a burst of damage and interrupts anyone within 30 yards. Make sure you interrupt this cast. Interrupt the Living Rot's Wave of Decay to prevent them from spawning goo underneath themselves. Also dodge the swirlies that they mark under a random player, as this will do a burst of damage to you when it's hit by a bolt a few seconds later. Diseased Lashers are really dangerous trash mobs when pulled in great numbers. You want to make sure that you interrupt their Decaying Mindcast, otherwise it will apply a very long disease debuff on a random player, which stuns them and absorbs a large amount of incoming healing. You can remove the debuff by dispelling the disease, or simply out-healing the absorption shield. Now before pulling the next boss, Cragmaw the Infested, you want to make sure that you clear a good amount of trash. You can skip clearing aside the room if you like, but just be ready to deal with them if you do accidentally pull them during the boss fight.
Now whilst fighting Cragmaw the Infested, each of his abilities will spawn a bunch of larvae on the ground nearby. After 8 seconds, these will turn into blood ticks, which act similarly to the other ticks in the instance, applying a stacking dot to the tank and exploding upon death. Now the larvae can be removed by simply running over them. The entire group should focus on doing this throughout the fight to make sure that you have as few ticks spawn as possible. Now the tank will need to permanently face the boss away from the group because of his indigestion frontal breath. After the breath is ended, make sure you quickly squish the bugs that spawn in front of the boss. The group needs to avoid standing in the boss's path as it charges towards a random player, as it will deal damage and knock back anyone in its way. You do not want to move too far away from this path, as a bunch of larvae will spawn along the route, so make sure you're quick to squish them out. When the boss gains 100% energy, he will go into a tantrum, dealing damage to players over 6 seconds while stomping randomly around the encounter area, of course leaving a bunch of larvae in his path. Now, it is super unlikely that you'll be able to squish all of these bugs when this is cast, as they are so spread out, so make sure you just get the ones that are nearby and then quickly kill off the ticks that spawn 8 seconds later. You need to be careful with cleave abilities during this time if you haven't cleared all the trash, as it is very easy to accidentally pull additional mobs during this tantrum if you're slamming cleave spells into the boss. After he's dead, you can move further on into the instance. You'll face reanimated guardians which will cast Bone Shield on themselves, applying a magic buff which absorbs a set amount of incoming damage. Either interrupt the casts or purge the buff to start dealing damage to the mob. You want to interrupt the Fallen Death Speaker's Raise Dead cast, otherwise a reanimated guardian will spawn nearby. You also want to interrupt their Wicked Frenzy and Rage buff or just soothe it off, otherwise the Death Speaker will have 100% more haste and their melee attacks will deal additional magic damage. Now, grotesque horrors are burrowed underneath the ground. You can see where they are as there's a little red and grey cloud on the ground. If you move too close to this patch, the horror will emerge and fight you. When fighting these, you need to interrupt their Deathbolt cast, as it will deal damage and apply a magic dot to all players in the group. This ability is cast super frequently, so you will need multiple interrupts to make sure the spell doesn't go off. You can also stun the horrors as a backup if you do run out of kicks. At later points in the instance, there are scenarios where you could potentially pull 2 horrors at once. This can be pretty disastrous, as you know, you've got 2 casts going on at the same time. Just CC one of them and focus down the other. Bloodsworn Defilers are super dangerous spellcasters. Make sure you interrupt their Withering Curse channel, which applies a 10% damage dealt reduction and a 10% damage taken increase every 3 seconds over 12 seconds. The Shadowbolt Volley should also be interrupted, especially if the group has any Withering Curse stacks. These Defilers will also spawn a Spirit Drain totem nearby after a short interruptible cast. You either need to kill the totem or simply move away from it before it explodes and stuns nearby players for 12 seconds. Once you do finally get through all this trash, you're ready to fight Xan Cha. Now, this boss has multiple mushrooms around the encounter space. The group needs to destroy these mushrooms with the boss's abilities, otherwise they will explode when the boss reaches 100% energy, dealing damage and applying a stackable disease dot to everyone in the group. If any mushrooms are left over when the boss reaches 100% energy, somebody should just go and soak them, as this will only deal damage and apply the dot to them and not the entire group. The best person for this is somebody with a mobile immunity such as a rogue or a hunter, and if not, the tank is probably the next best bet. Now, when fighting the boss, the tank should face it into a pack of shrooms for when the shockwave is cast. This deals damage to anyone within the frontal cone whilst also destroying the shrooms it hits. Players targeted by upheaval should surround themselves in a pack of shrooms. After 6 seconds, they will leave a patch on the ground, which will explode 1 second later, dealing damage to anyone and destroying any shrooms within the zones. Shortly after upheaval has gone off, the group will need to dodge the volatile pod spores that will travel slowly across the encounter space. If you're hit by a spore, you'll take a burst of damage and receive a disease dot. After the boss reaches 100 energy and destroys all the shrooms with his Festering Harvest cast, he will spawn a new set of shrooms and the encounter will repeat from there. Just make sure you keep on top of the shrooms and you should be fine. Once the boss dies, you can now progress further into the instance and move towards the last boss.
The group will encounter Bloodsworn Defilers, Grotesque Horrors, Reanimated Guardians, and Fallen Death Speakers on the way towards the next boss. A lot of this trash can be skipped by hugging the walls of the room. However, as pointed out by Alex earlier, you might need to clear quite a lot of this just for Mythic Plus percentage. You also fight Faceless Corruptors. You want to make sure that you move from their frontal cone breath called Maddening Gaze, which will otherwise deal a burst of damage and fear you. Multiple tentacles will appear nearby when Abyssal Reach is cast. Simply move away from them to avoid their melee hits. After you've made it through that area, you'll want to jump down a magic tunnel and into a room with the last boss, the Unbound Abomination. Now, this boss doesn't take direct damage from players, and instead, damage dealt to him will just fill up his energy bar. Once he has 100% energy, 2 Blood Visage ads will spawn. These ads do not have any abilities and will just melee whoever has threat on them. Killing the ad will deal 17% max health damage to the boss. Now, while fighting, the group should stand so that the boss will vomit into the walls when he casts Vile Expulsion at a random player. As soon as the cast begins, all players should sidestep out of the way to avoid the incoming damage. The breath will leave a bunch of patches on the ground which deals ticking damage to anyone who stands within them, so make sure you don't. Occasionally, the patches will form into rotting spore ads that will travel towards the group. If they reach a player, they'll explode, dealing a ton of damage whilst melting back into a patch of goo. DPS need to quickly kill these low health ads before they reach you. The boss will frequently apply Putrid Blood Dot to the entire group. This 12-second debuff can be dispelled, however it is applied to everyone frequently enough for it to stack. The group should remain stacked up as the nearby Keeper ally will apply a Holy Cleansing Light zone around a player which dispels all Putrid Blood stacks. This Keeper ally will also help kill Blood Visage ads. As a DPS, if you see him channeling into one ad, you should always focus the other one, as the channeled ad will get absolutely destroyed. But that's all you need to know for this encounter, and that wraps up the Underrot dungeon.
Thank you very much for watching. If this guide did help you out, then make sure you do leave a like on it. It helps us out a lot. And if you do want more information about any of the trash or any of the encounters in this instance, then do go check out our written work over on Wowhead. The link for that can be found in the description below. And before we do go, a big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. We really do appreciate your continued support, so thank you so much. If you want to join this awesome group of people, a link for our Patreon can be found in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for watching.